Well, good evening, and I hope you all are enjoying a bit of Appalachia as it fades behind me. I fit in quite well here. I, ever since I was young, have loved a bit of the macabre. Whether it's death rituals or the celebrations around Halloween. But because I'm a traveler, I find my way into the spooky places. Now, some people will tell you that the spookiest is that terrible decay that you find in beautiful old kirkyards, or maybe the moonlight on an old manor house. But no, I would argue that the spookiest place is an old and humble inn. Um, I've been to quite a few, of course, in my travels, and every once in a while you find one that isn't so bad to lay your head, and you keep coming back to it because it's better than not knowing what you're getting yourself into. It, you know, ever since man has been traveling, we have put ourselves in this vulnerable position wherein you're not sure if you're going to make it, whether it's mother nature or perhaps the unsavory elements of man. So having some place that you can stay and feel safe is so important. So important that even the ancient Greeks had a term for this. It was xenia. And xenia was this concept of the host and guest contract, what you did right so that you didn't endanger those staying with you and that you didn't endanger yourself. But I found my best zinnia at a not so humbly named humble old royal inn. It's a beautiful old inn that is just been added onto over the years. The timber mishmashed with local limestone and brick. It's somehow both ancient and out of time. And the men who own it now, lovely family, they're generations into owning this place. But before that, before the generations upon generations, there was another family, the old Inman family. Um, the Inman family owned the old Royal Inn at a time when the old Royal Inn was not exactly much to shake a stick at. Of course, it's a very humble abode now. But at the time, due to disrepair, unfortunately, they could only let one or two rooms at a time, and the public house was quite a bit run down. Um, as such, even though they were so well situated, only a day's journey from a close city and a beautiful running river nearby and crossroads, which those have their own superstitions, travelers would go the longer route because they weren't certain they would have lodgings when they arrived. And this wasn't good for business. No, indeed. So, one cold, dead winter's eve, as the wind was howling and a storm was raging, a knock came at their door, and a weary, strange little traveler asked for admittance. You see, he had very meager coin, but asked for only a spot by the fire. The Inmans, a young family understanding what generosity could do for this guest, brought him in and gave him a room of his own, the only one they had to let that night. They said it was nonsense. He could stay as long as he needed, or at least until the storm had passed. The man was very thankful and ate the stew that Mrs. Inman had brought him. Mm. The next morning, she sought to take good care of their guest again. The storm had passed, but she figured he might be hungry from the night. And when she entered the room, the bed was unslept in. The only sign of habitants, just a few old coins and a note which said, "May good fortune last as long as your generosity." Sure enough, after this stay, the Inmans had 7 years of good fortune, which their young sons turned into strapping young lads. A new spring actually appeared on their property, one that had beautiful sweet water. Mr. Inman built a little bathhouse and even a lagering cellar where he could store beer brewed from this sweet water. And most importantly, more rooms. Uh, 7 years to the day after that first weary traveler had arrived, I had a full house save for one room. Raucous laughter filled the halls as they opened the door to another knock. Oh, against the wind, there was another man bundled against this poor storm, some sort of instrument upon his back. And he asked them if he could only just come in and shelter from the storm for a while. Oh, they knew that they only had one room left to let, but that should another traveler come along with perhaps a little more coin than this man, they could at least make some money off the room. And so they told him, No, we don't have a place for someone of meager coinage. You can stay for free in the forest." He appealed. He said he would only take a spot by the fire if only he could just warm his feet. He would even sing for his supper, as it were. They told him no again. Now, the third time he appealed to their generosity. He said, "Out of the kindness of your heart, can you please just let me in?" At this, the elder Inmans closed the door, turning him away. Almost immediately, fortune seemed to turn. The guests started to hear strange noises in the night as if rats were scratching in the walls, and that's never good for an inn. And then people reported that they were being awoken in the night as if someone was looming over them in the shadows. The last proverbial nail in the coffin was the freak spring storm which took down the bathhouse. There was a guest still inside who was injured in the unfortunate falling of the stone. At this point, Mr. Inman himself started to drink his own beer, turned sour from the lack of access to the spring. To the point that it was not a surprise when his young sons found him dead in a pool of his own blood, having dashed his head upon the limestone from which the beautiful loggerine cellar had been cut. Unfortunately, Mrs. Inman locked herself in a room, wailing with grief, saddened by, of course, the loss of her husband. But as her days grew shorter, she brought her husband, brought her dear sons in to confess it was not her husband alone she was mourning for, but rather for the woman she once was, for the death of her generosity. For in that time she had plenty to think, and realized that good fortune had turned on them solely because they had turned their back on kindness. And as her wails echoed down further empty halls, the boys grieved their mother, and she passed on. They sold the inn, just enough money to bury their parents properly. And they moved off onto the city to make only knows what stories of themselves. New owners tried to restore the bathhouse, but found the spring had dried up and decided to focus on being a safe haven instead of any sort of opulence. And to this day, many, many years later, it is said, however safe it may be, a traveler still might feel watched at night or hear a knock on the door when the cold winds blow. And sometimes, even when the spring winds seem friendly, they hear the calling of a woman in mourning. How I would tell you of my own experiences, but who am I beyond a weary traveler looking to sing for my supper?